A cave in southern Germany, cold enough that breath hangs in the air even in summer. In a drawer in a research lab nearby sits a piece of vulture bone, no longer than a pencil, pierced with 5 small holes. It does not look like much. It looks like something a child might have whittled on a rainy afternoon. But this object is older than the pyramids by tens of thousands of years, and someone, in the dark of an Ice Age winter, sat down and carved it into something that could make music. For a long time, the story of early humans was a story of survival and nothing else. The textbook image was simple: cold, hunger, flint, fire. People hunted, people froze, people occasionally painted on a wall if they had a spare moment. Music in this picture was an afterthought, something that came later, once humanity had the luxury of being more than merely alive. The tidy version of prehistory left very little room for joy. The blind spot existed because organic material does not survive well. Bone rots, wood rots, a drum skin or a reed pipe disappears in a few centuries, let alone 40,000 years. Archaeologists were left mostly with stone, and stone does not sing. Whole soundscapes of the ancient world simply evaporated, leaving historians to assume that if there was no surviving instrument, there was probably no music worth mentioning. Then, in the early 2000s, researchers excavating Hohlefels Cave in Germany found fragments of bone with a particular pattern of holes, spaced with a precision that did not look accidental. By 2009, a team led by archaeologist Nicholas Conard had pieced together a flute carved from a vulture's wing bone, dated to roughly 42,000 years ago. It was not a crude noisemaker. The finger holes were spaced for a scale. Whoever made it understood pitch. This changes the shape of the Ice Age entirely. These were not just people scraping by. They were composers, in some basic sense, shaping bone into something whose only purpose was sound and feeling. A flute serves no nutritional function. It does not keep you warm. Its only job is to be heard, perhaps around a fire, perhaps in a ritual, perhaps simply because someone wanted to hear a note hang in the cold air and fade. The presence of music this early suggests that whatever made us human arrived as a complete package. Language, art, and melody, bundled together, long before agriculture, long before cities, long before anything we would call civilization. It means the silence we assume surrounded our ancestors was never really there. They were listening to something. We just couldn't hear it until the bone surfaced. 40,000 years of silence, broken by a single, deliberate note. Another kind of pattern, written not in bone, but in the sky. A scribe presses a wedge-shaped stylus into wet clay, recording the sun vanishing at midday. The tablet will dry, harden, and be buried under the rubble of a collapsing civilization for over 3,000 years before anyone reads it again. The established view of ancient astronomy held that early civilizations watched the sky mostly with fear, treating the heavens as a theatre for omens and gods, with little genuine observation behind it. Eclipses, in this telling, were superstition dressed up as record-keeping, frightening but not particularly precise. The numbers, if they existed at all, were assumed to be vague, mythologized, more poetry than data. The problem was access. The clay tablets recording these observations were written in cuneiform, a script that went unreadable to the modern world for nearly 2,000 years after the last person who could read it died. Even after cuneiform was deciphered in the 19th century, The tablets describing celestial events were scattered across museum basements, misfiled, mislabeled, treated as administrative debris rather than scientific record. Nobody was looking for an eclipse in a stack of tax receipts. The breakthrough came through patient philology rather than a single dramatic dig. Assyriologists working through the British Museum's collection of Babylonian tablets in the late 19th and 20th centuries began identifying systematic astronomical diaries, some referencing a solar eclipse that modern astronomers could date with precision to 1223 BCE, recorded at Ugarit, and later far more detailed Babylonian eclipse records from the 8th century BCE onward, kept with a consistency that allowed later astronomers to calculate the exact day, sometimes the exact hour, of darkness falling over Mesopotamia. This is not folklore. This is data collected across generations by people who understood that today's observation was only useful if tomorrow's astronomer could compare it to the last one. The Babylonians were not recording eclipses because they were afraid. They were recording them because they had built an institution dedicated to watching the sky carefully enough to notice when it broke its own pattern, and then predict when it might happen again. It suggests that the human impulse towards science, the slow accumulation of careful observation passed from one generation to the next, did not begin with Greek philosophers staring at the stars in wonder. It began earlier, in clay, in bureaucratic patience, in scribes who treated the heavens as something that could be studied rather than only feared. Long before anyone had a word for astronomy, someone was already keeping its first ledger. The sun went dark over a kingdom that no longer exists, and a stranger's careful handwriting is the only reason we know exactly when. From the sky down to a single foot. In a tomb near Luxor, wrapped against a woman's mummified remains, sits a wooden and leather big toe, carved with joints, stitched with care, shaped to fit the curve of a foot that had lost its own. The wear on its underside shows it was used, walked on, lived with. For most of modern history, the textbook story of prosthetics began in the modern era, with wheelchairs and metal limbs and surgical innovation treated as a story of the last 2 centuries. Ancient peoples, in this telling, simply endured disability, or hid it, or treated missing limbs as something beyond remedy. The assumption was that compassion of this particular practical kind, the urge to engineer a replacement body part, was a relatively recent moral development. The gap existed because organic prosthetics rarely survive. Wood and leather decay quickly outside of Egypt's unusually dry tombs. Most ancient amputees left no trace of how or whether they coped. And even when such an object did survive, there was no guarantee anyone would recognize it as medical rather than decorative, a piece of funerary symbolism rather than a tool used in daily life. The discovery came from the Cairo Museum's collection, examined closely by a research team that included Jackie Finch of the University of Manchester. Working with a volunteer test subject missing the same toe, Finch's team built faithful replicas of the Egyptian device, dated to between 950 and 710 BCE, and asked her to walk in traditional Egyptian sandals. The data was unambiguous. The prosthetic toe was not symbolic. It distributed weight correctly. It allowed a more natural gait. The wear patterns matched genuine, repeated use. This shifts the picture of ancient medicine substantially. Egyptian physicians were not merely embalming bodies for the next life. They were solving the practical, mechanical problem of how a living person walks without a part of their own foot, with attention to biomechanics that would not be matched again for centuries. It suggests that the desire to restore function and dignity to an injured body is not a modern sensibility bolted onto an indifferent past. It is ancient. It was carved by hand, fitted by hand, walked in every day by someone whose name we will never know. A toe made of wood carried a person across 3,000 years of sand and still left footprints we can measure today. From a foot to a single skeleton found broken across a hillside in Ethiopia. The established story of human origins, taught for most of the 20th century, placed our ancestors as creatures who stood upright only after their brains had already grown large. The sequence felt intuitive. Bigger brain, smarter creature. Then, eventually, that creature finds a reason to walk on two legs. Intelligence, in this telling, came first. Posture followed. The problem was simply the absence of fossils old enough to test the idea. Hominin remains earlier than about 3 million years were scarce, fragmentary, and mostly limited to skulls, which biased the entire field toward brain-first thinking, because brains were what could be measured and compared. In November 1974, paleoanthropologist Donald Johanson and graduate student Tom Gray were surveying a gully in the Afar region of Ethiopia when a fragment of bone caught Johanson's eye. Over the following weeks, the team recovered roughly 40% of a single skeleton, an extraordinary proportion for a fossil this old. The skeleton, designated AL288-1, dated to about 3.2 million years ago, and was named Lucy after a Beatles song playing in camp that night. Her pelvis and leg bones showed clear adaptations for walking upright. Her skull showed a brain barely larger than a chimpanzee's. The sequence was backward. Lucy walked long before her descendants thought in any way we would recognize as human-like. Upright walking came first, by millions of years, and everything else, tool use, language, the expansion of the brain, came later, built on top of a body that had already chosen to stand. It means that what made us human did not begin in the mind. It began in the hips, in the ankles, in a body that found an advantage in seeing further across the grass, freeing the hands for something else entirely. Lucy could not have imagined what her descendants would build. She simply stood up and left the rest to time. She never knew she was the beginning of anything. She was only trying to get a better view of the grass. A different hillside, a different country, a skull small enough to fit in two hands, found beside the ruins of a medieval town in the country of Georgia. For decades, the established view of human migration was orderly and linear. Early hominins evolved in Africa, developed larger brains and sophisticated tools, and only then, fully formed and well-equipped, ventured out across the rest of the world. The story had a clean sequence. Brain growth first, global wandering second. Anything outside Africa older than roughly 1 million years was considered, by this logic, essentially impossible. The blind spot came from a kind of circular reasoning. Because no early hominin fossils had been found outside Africa, researchers assumed none existed, and because none were expected, few archaeologists looked closely at sites outside Africa for remains this old. The town of Dmanisi was being excavated for its medieval ruins, not its prehistory, when something far older turned up beneath the foundations. In 1991, archaeologists working at Dmanisi found a jawbone unlike anything in the medieval layer above it. Over the following 2 decades, excavations led by David Lord Kipanidze and his team uncovered 5 skulls in total, dated to about 1.8 million years ago. The oldest hominin remains ever found outside Africa. Stranger still, the 5 skulls varied wildly from each other. Different brain sizes, different facial structures, enough that, if found separately, they might have been classified as different species entirely. Yet, they were found together, in the same small patch of ground, at the same time. This collapsed an entire framework of how species get named. If one population could show this much natural variation, then perhaps many of the supposed separate species scattered across the early human family tree were never separate at all. They may have simply been the normal range of difference within a single, widespread population, one that had already left Africa far earlier than anyone believed, with a brain barely a third the size of a modern human's, navigating mountains and unfamiliar terrain, with nothing but stone tools and whatever instinct carried them there. It means our ancestors did not wait until they were impressive to go exploring. They left while still small-brained, while still vulnerable, while still essentially animals figuring out the world one valley at a time. Curiosity, it turns out, arrived long before the intellect to justify it. 5 skulls, 1 hillside, and an entire human family tree quietly rearranged. A different skull, found at the bottom of a well, hidden there deliberately, 85 years before anyone looked. The story of human evolution in Asia had long been treated as a side note to the main narrative, which ran primarily through Africa and Europe. Fossils from China were acknowledged but rarely given a starring role. The textbook assumption was that East Asia's human fossil record, while real, was peripheral, a regional footnote rather than a central chapter. In 1933, during the construction of a bridge in Harbin, China, a labourer uncovered an extraordinarily well-preserved skull. Fearing it would be seized by occupying Japanese forces during a turbulent period in Chinese history, the man wrapped the skull and lowered it into a family well, where it sat, hidden for decades, its existence known only within his family. He told no outsider before his death. His descendants only revealed its location in 2018, finally allowing scientists to retrieve it. When researchers led by Chiang Ji finally examined the skull in detail, the results, published in 2021, were striking. The cranium was massive, robust, with a brain case comparable in size to a modern human's, yet a face broad and heavy-browed enough to look almost otherworldly. Dated to at least 146,000 years old, it was distinct enough from any known human lineage that the team proposed an entirely new species, Homo longi, nicknamed Dragon Man, after the region where it was found. If the classification holds, it suggests East Asia was home to its own distinct, deeply diverged human lineage, one that may be more closely related to us than the Neanderthals were, quietly evolving in parallel for hundreds of thousands of years, while the spotlight of paleontology stayed fixed on Europe and Africa. It is a reminder that the human story was never a single corridor. It was a sprawling, branching house, and we have only been exploring a few of its rooms. A man hid a skull from soldiers, and accidentally hid an entire species from science for 85 years. From a well to a cave on a small island east of Bali. The textbook story of human evolution held a simple rule. Brains only got bigger over time, Once a lineage developed a large brain, it did not shrink again, not meaningfully, not for hundreds of thousands of years. Evolution, in the popular imagination, moved in one direction, toward more capacity, more complexity, more of everything that made a hominin recognizably advanced. The gap existed partly because Flores Island in Indonesia was not considered a likely place to search. It was small, remote, separated from the rest of the world by deep ocean straits that early hominins, lacking boats, supposedly could not have crossed. No one expected to find ancient humans there at all, let alone something that broke the rules of brain evolution. In 2003, a joint Australian and Indonesian team excavating Liang Bua Cave, led by Mike Morwood and Thomas Sutikna, uncovered a remarkably small, nearly complete skeleton. The individual stood roughly 3.5 feet tall, with a brain about the size of a chimpanzee's, yet associated with stone tools sophisticated enough to suggest real cognitive ability, dated to around 60,000 to 100,000 years ago. The find was named Homo floresiensis, and almost immediately nicknamed the Hobbit. The implications split the field for years. A brain this small, producing tools this advanced, did not fit the assumed relationship between brain size and intelligence. Some researchers proposed the Hobbit descended from Homo erectus, shrinking over generations in isolation, an island effect seen in other species marooned on small land masses with limited resources. Others suggested an even older, more primitive ancestor. Either way, the assumption that bigger brains were always better, always the goal of evolution, did not survive contact with this small skeleton in a cave by the sea. It means evolution does not march steadily toward what we consider progress. It adapts to circumstance, sometimes by growing, sometimes by shrinking, indifferent to our expectations about what intelligence should look like or how it should be housed. Somewhere on a small island, a small population solved survival in their own way and never asked permission from the rest of the family tree. A brain the size of a fist still managed to carry fire, and tools, and a story we are still trying to finish. From an island in the Pacific to a cave in the mountains of Siberia. The established narrative of ancient humanity for most of the 20th century recognized exactly two players in Eurasia during the deep past: modern humans spreading out from Africa and Neanderthals already settled across Europe and parts of Asia. The story had two characters. It did not seem to need a third. The problem was the sheer scarcity of the evidence. Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains had been excavated for years, yielding only scattered fragments. Nothing dramatic enough to suggest an entirely new branch of humanity was hiding among the dust. A piece of bone from a finger is, by any normal standard, nothing. It is the kind of fragment most digs discard without a second glance. In 2008, researchers recovered a small fragment of a finger bone from a child in Denisova Cave. Rather than relying on its shape, which offered little information, a team led by Johannes Kraus and Svante Pääbo at the Max Planck Institute extracted and sequenced its mitochondrial DNA in 2010. The genetic signature did not match modern humans. It did not match Neanderthals either. It belonged to something else entirely, a previously unknown population now called the Denisovans, known to science almost entirely through genetics rather than appearance, since so little of their physical remains have ever been found. Further genetic study revealed something even stranger. Denisovan DNA survives today, in meaningful amounts in the genomes of certain populations in Melanesia and parts of Asia, including genetic variants that help some modern populations adapt to high altitude. An entire lineage of humanity, invisible in the fossil record, had nonetheless left its signature quietly inside living people, inherited without their ever knowing its origin. It means whole branches of the human family may exist that we will never find as bones, only as fragments of code passed down through thousands of generations, written into the bodies of people walking around today. History is not only what survives in stone. Some of it survives in blood, silent, unannounced, waiting for a sequencer powerful enough to finally read it. A bone the size of a fingertip rewrote the population of an entire continent's deep past. From genetics to something simpler, a handful of shells, pierced and strung, found in a cave overlooking the Mediterranean. For much of the 20th century, decoration and self-expression were treated as relatively late developments in human history, arriving alongside cave paintings and figurines, tens of thousands of years after our species first appeared. Early humans, in the conventional telling, were practical creatures first, ornamental ones only much later, once survival was no longer an urgent daily concern. The blind spot existed because shell beads look, at first glance, like nothing at all. A pierced shell can be mistaken for one simply broken by waves or scavengers. Without close microscopic analysis, the deliberate human hand behind the hole is invisible, indistinguishable from natural wear. For decades, such shells sat in collection drawers, unexamined, assumed to be ordinary debris. In the early 2000s, researchers led by Francesco Derrico and Marian van Heren re-examined shell beads from sites including School Cave in Israel and Blombos Cave in South Africa. Using microscopes to study the wear patterns around the holes, they found clear evidence of intentional perforation and stringing, with some beads coated in red ochre pigment. The shells, some species not even native to the immediate area, had been transported from elsewhere, deliberately chosen. Dated to around 100,000 to 120,000 years ago, they are among the earliest known ornaments made by humans. This pushes the desire for adornment back tens of thousands of years earlier than previously assumed, into a period when humans were still confined largely to small pockets of Africa and the Near East. It suggests that long before complex language can be proven, before agriculture, before permanent settlements, people were already choosing to decorate themselves, to signal identity, perhaps status, perhaps belonging to a particular group, perhaps simply beauty for its own sake. The impulse to wear something meaningful around the neck was not a refinement added once survival became easy. It may be one of the very first things that made us recognizably us. A handful of shells suggests that vanity, or perhaps something gentler than vanity, is older than civilization itself. Another kind of marking, this time directly on skin. The textbook story of tattooing, for a long time, treated it as primarily decorative, a practice with shallow historical roots, often associated narrowly with particular tribal cultures, and rarely connected to the wider ancient world. Mummies, when found with marks on their skin, were sometimes assumed to be the result of decay or accidental staining, rather than deliberate art. The gap came from preservation and perception both. Tattoos on skin require exceptional conditions to survive thousands of years, and even when they do survive, faded ink on darkened, mummified skin is easy to overlook entirely. mistaken for discoloration unless examined under infrared light. In 2018, researchers led by Renee Friedman used infrared imaging to re-examine 2 Egyptian mummies held by the British Museum, dated to around 3,350 to 3,100 BCE, predating the unification of Egypt itself. Beneath the surface, infrared revealed clear figurative tattoos. On one body, a bull and a sheep. On the other, S-shaped motifs running along the arm. These were the earliest known figurative tattoos in the world, far older than previously documented examples from Ötzi the Iceman, which had been mostly simple lines. This discovery suggests tattooing in ancient Egypt was deliberate and symbolic from a very early period, likely connected to status, strength, or ritual meaning, practiced by both men and women, rather than confined to one gender or class, as later assumptions held. It implies a far older, more widespread tradition of body art across ancient cultures than physical evidence alone had ever been able to prove, hidden simply because the right imaging technology did not exist until the 21st century. It means the body has always been a canvas, and we are only now developing the tools sensitive enough to read what was written on it 5,000 years ago. Light invisible to the eye revealed a bull tattooed on an arm that had been silent for 5,000 years. From skin to a piece of ancient gum, spat out by a teenager beside a fjord in Scandinavia. The conventional view of how we study ancient humans relied almost entirely on bones and teeth for genetic material. Skeletons, when they survived at all, were the primary, often the only, source for understanding who ancient people were, what they looked like, how they were related to each other. The problem was that complete skeletons are rare, and at many sites, none survive at all. Researchers excavating Siltholm, a wetland site in Denmark, found stone tools and food waste, but no human remains whatsoever. By the standard rules of archaeology, this should have meant no genetic information could be recovered from the site at all. In 2019, researchers led by Hannes Schroeder examined a small lump of chewed birch pitch, a tar-like substance used as an ancient form of chewing gum, found at the site and dated to roughly 5,700 years ago. Saliva left behind in the material had preserved usable human DNA. The genetic profile revealed the chewer was a young, dark-skinned, dark-haired woman with blue eyes, closely related to other hunter-gatherers from mainland Europe, rather than the farming populations that were beginning to spread through the region at the time. The gum also preserved DNA from the foods she had recently eaten, including hazelnuts and duck. This opened an entirely new category of archaeological evidence. A person no longer needs to leave behind a skeleton to leave behind a complete genetic and dietary record. A moment of idle chewing, discarded without a second thought, became a 5,000-year-old time capsule, more detailed in some ways than many actual graves. It means countless ordinary, unremarkable moments. A child spitting out gum, a hand discarding a scrap, maybe quietly waiting in the mud, holding identities that bones themselves were never able to preserve. She left no grave behind. She left a piece of gum, and it told us more than most skeletons ever could. From a discarded scrap to a deliberate meal, baked in the embers of a fire in the Jordanian desert. The established story of bread placed its origin firmly alongside the birth of agriculture, roughly 10,000 years ago, when humans first domesticated wheat and barley. bread, in this telling, was a product of farming, impossible before people had settled down to deliberately cultivate grain. Hunter-gatherers, by definition, were not supposed to have bread at all. The blind spot existed because charred plant remains are fragile and easily overlooked, often discarded as unidentifiable ash by earlier excavation methods that lacked the patience or the equipment to examine such fragments closely. In 2018, a team led by Amaya Arantz Otaigui examined charred food remains from Shubaika 1, a site in northeastern Jordan used by hunter-gatherers. Using scanning electron microscopy, the team identified the remains as bread made from wild wheat, barley, and the tubers of clubrush plants, ground and mixed before baking. Radiocarbon dating placed the bread at roughly 14,400 years old, more than 4,000 years, before the agricultural revolution was believed to have made bread possible at all. This means bread did not cause farming. If anything, the relationship may run in reverse. The desire for more bread, more reliably, more often, may have been one of the very motivations that pushed hunter-gatherers toward the laborious, uncertain work of deliberately planting and tending grain in the first place. A food we associate entirely with settled civilization turns out to have been invented by people who are still wandering, still hunting, still living without permanent walls. It suggests that the line between the wild world and civilization was never as sharp as it has been drawn. Someone, 14,000 years ago, ground wild grain into flour simply because it tasted like something worth the effort, long before anyone called that effort agriculture. Civilization did not invent bread. Bread, in its own quiet way, may have invented civilization. Where there is grain, there is often something else fermenting nearby. For a long time, beer's origins were treated as a side effect of bread making, an accident discovered only after farming had already become established, a happy byproduct of stored grain that got wet and started to ferment, more curiosity than craft. Brewing, in this picture, was simple and almost incidental. The gap existed because identifying ancient fermentation requires finding residue at a molecular level, something far beyond visible inspection. Stone vessels look empty to the naked eye, even when they are coated, invisibly, in the chemical signatures of beer brewed thousands of years earlier. In 2018, researchers led by Li Liu examined stone mortars from Raqefet Cave in Israel, a site used by the Natufian culture, and found chemical residues consistent with deliberate beer brewing, dated to around 13,000 years ago, again predating settled agriculture. Separately, in 2016, residue analysis on pottery from Jiahu, China, suggested fermented rice and fruit beverages dating back roughly 9,000 years, among the earliest known alcoholic drinks tied to a farming society. The Natufian evidence, in particular, suggested brewing took place deliberately, likely for ritual or communal feasting, with malting, mashing, and fermentation steps that required real technical knowledge, not accidental spoilage. This reframes alcohol not as an accident discovered late, but as a deliberate technology developed by people who understood fermentation well enough to do it on purpose, likely for shared ceremonial gatherings tied to the dead or to important social occasions. It suggests that the desire to come together, to mark an occasion, to alter consciousness collectively rather than alone, motivated real technical innovation among people who had not yet settled into permanent villages. It means some of humanity's earliest chemistry was not aimed at survival at all. It was aimed at celebration. Before there was a single permanent home, there may have already been a toast. A different drink, this time bitter, ground from the seeds of a fruit growing wild in the forests of Central America. The conventional story of chocolate's origins centered on the Aztecs and Maya, civilizations who were known to drink a bitter, spiced cacao beverage, often associated with elite ritual and trade. The timeline rarely extended much earlier than around 1900 BCE, treating cacao use as a relatively late refinement of established Mesoamerican cultures. The blind spot existed because cacao itself decomposes quickly, leaving almost nothing behind in the archaeological record, except, occasionally, theobromine, a chemical compound unique to the cacao plant, which can sometimes be detected residue on ancient pottery if anyone thinks to test for it. In 2018, a team led by Francisco Valdez and Sonia Zarillo tested pottery fragments from the Santa Ana, Florida site in Ecuador, examining starch grains, theobromine residue, and ancient DNA together. The results pushed the earliest confirmed use of cacao back to roughly 5,300 years ago, associated with the Mayo Chinchipe culture of the Amazon region, far earlier and far further south than the Aztec or Maya heartland. The cacao appeared to have been used not primarily as the rich chocolate drink of later cultures, but possibly for its pulp, fermented into a kind of early alcoholic beverage, with the seeds themselves becoming valuable only later. This means chocolate's true origin lies not in the temples of Mexico, but in the Amazon basin, thousands of years before the civilizations most associated with it ever existed. The plant traveled, both physically and culturally, carried along trade routes northward over millennia, slowly transforming from a forest fruit into a sacred, bitter drink, and eventually into the sweet, mass-produced product of the modern world. It suggests that some of our most familiar pleasures took the longest, strangest journeys to reach us, passing through hands and cultures we will never be able to fully trace. A bitter Amazonian fruit traveled thousands of years and thousands of miles before it ever tasted like anything we would recognize as chocolate. From a forest fruit to a fermented grape, in the mountains between modern Georgia and Armenia. For decades, the established narrative placed the birth of winemaking in the Eastern Mediterranean, with evidence from sites in Iran and the broader Near East often considered the earliest reliable proof, dated to roughly 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. Earlier claims were treated with skepticism, dismissed as the byproduct of wild, uncultivated grapes rather than intentional fermentation. The gap existed partly because wine residue, like beer residue, is chemically subtle, and partly because the Caucasus region had been comparatively under-excavated by Western archaeological teams during much of the 20th century, leaving a significant gap in the available evidence from that area. In 2017, a team led by Patrick McGovern analysed residue from large clay jars, known as kvevri, found at the Neolithic site of Gadakrili Gora in Georgia. Chemical analysis revealed tartaric acid, a compound strongly associated with grapes, embedded in pottery dated to roughly 6,000 BCE, making it among the earliest confirmed evidence of winemaking anywhere in the world. The vessels themselves were enormous, clearly designed for fermenting and storing large quantities of liquid, suggesting wine production was already a structured, intentional, and probably social practice, not an isolated accident. This places one of the earliest known wine cultures not in Mesopotamia or Egypt, the regions most commonly associated with ancient luxury, but in the foothills of the Caucasus, among people who had only just begun farming at all. It suggests that the technical knowledge required to deliberately ferment grapes in carefully designed and constructed vessels developed nearly as early as agriculture itself, almost as if the cultivation of the grape and the desire to transform it were part of the very same impulse. It implies that pleasure, refined and deliberate pleasure, was never a late addition to human civilization. It arrived practically at civilization's doorstep, asking to be let in early. 8,000 years before a modern glass was ever poured, someone in the Caucasus Mountains was already doing the same thing, by candlelight, in clay. One more substance from the ancient pantry, this one needing no fermentation at all to survive. The popular assumption about food preservation generally treats almost everything as eventually succumbing to decay. Even ancient grain, when found, has long since rotted into dust. The idea that any food could remain genuinely edible after thousands of years felt, to most people, simply impossible, regardless of how it was stored. The gap here was less about access to evidence and more about underestimating a particular substance's chemistry. Honey's resistance to spoilage was known anecdotally for centuries, but rarely tested rigorously against ancient archaeological samples, old enough to prove the claim definitively. In tombs across ancient Egypt, archaeologists have repeatedly found sealed jars of honey, some dating back more than 3,000 years, occasionally still in a state that food scientists describe as edible, assuming the seal remained intact and no contamination occurred. The reason lies in honey's chemistry: extremely low moisture content, a naturally acidic pH, and the presence of hydrogen peroxide produced by an enzyme bees add during its creation, together creating an environment in which bacteria, mold, and most microorganisms simply cannot survive or reproduce. This means a sealed jar, if left entirely undisturbed, can theoretically remain edible indefinitely, limited only by physical degradation of its container, rather than the honey itself spoiling internally. It is one of the only foods on Earth that can make this claim, a substance whose preservation requires no human intervention at all. No salting, no smoking, no careful technique, only the bee's own chemistry, untouched by time in any way that matters to its edibility. It is a strange thought that somewhere in a tomb, sealed 3,000 years ago, sits a food more patient than the civilization that buried it, waiting, unspoiled, for someone who will never come to taste it. Empires fell, languages died, and the honey in a sealed jar did not even notice. From the patience of bees to the impatience of an annoyed customer. The popular imagination tends to treat writing's earliest uses as grand and ceremonial, devoted to kings, gods, laws, and monuments. The textbook assumption was that the first written words humanity preserved would concern matters of state or religion, dignified subjects worthy of being carved permanently into clay or stone. The gap existed because nobody expected something this mundane to survive, and even when it did, ordinary administrative tablets were often considered less worthy of careful translation and publication than royal inscriptions or epic literature. In the 1950s, a tablet excavated from the ancient city of Ur, dated to around 1750 BCE, was translated to reveal something startlingly ordinary. a merchant named Nani had written to a copper trader named Ea Nasir, furious that the copper ingots delivered were of inferior quality, and that his messenger had been treated disrespectfully during the transaction. The tablet is detailed, specific, and unmistakably irritated, demanding a refund and complaining at length about being shown contempt by a man he had trusted with his money. This small, irritated letter is now recognized as the oldest known written customer complaint in human history. It means writing was never reserved purely for the sacred or the monumental. It was, from a very early point, a tool for the deeply ordinary frustrations of daily commerce, used by people negotiating quality, fairness, and respect in transactions not so different from disputes that might unfold today. It suggests something almost comforting about human continuity. Across nearly 4,000 years, the specific words have changed entirely. The language is long dead, the empire is long gone, yet the underlying feeling of being cheated, of expecting better, of wanting it in writing, has not changed even slightly. Nearly 4,000 years later, a merchant's anger over bad copper still reaches us perfectly intact. From one man's complaint to an entire workforce's collective refusal. The conventional history of labor movements typically begins in the industrial era, with strikes framed as a product of factories, unions, and the specific tensions of capitalism in the 18th and 19th centuries. Ancient workers, by this account, were assumed to have had no real means or precedent for organized resistance against unfair treatment. The gap existed because such an event, if it occurred in the ancient world, would have left evidence only in administrative records, the kind of dry, bureaucratic documentation rarely considered exciting enough for early translators to prioritize. Records from the reign of Ramesses III, dated to around 1170 BCE, describe workers at the royal necropolis of Deir el-Medina, the skilled artisans responsible for building and decorating the tombs of pharaohs, who had not received their promised rations of grain. According to surviving documents, the workers organized and walked out, refusing to continue their labor, staging what amounts to history's first recorded labor strike, sitting down at the gates of nearby temples until their grievances were addressed. This means organized, collective refusal to work in protest of unfair conditions is not a product of industrial capitalism at all. It is ancient, present, even in a rigid, hierarchical society built around the absolute authority of a god-king. Even workers building tombs, meant to secure a pharaoh's eternal glory, understood that their labor had value, and that withholding it was a form of leverage no decree could fully erase. It suggests that the basic human recognition that work freely given can also be freely withheld is not a modern invention layered onto ancient obedience. It was present even beneath the shadow of the pyramids. Even in the service of eternal kings, mortal workers understood exactly how much power they actually held. From collective voices to a single one, claiming her name for the first time in recorded history. For most of history's early written record, authorship was anonymous, attributed to gods, to tradition, to no one in particular. The idea of an individual claiming personal credit for a specific written work felt, to many historians, like a later literary development, something tied to a more developed sense of the self. The gap existed because so much ancient writing survives without any signature at all. The names of scribes and composers lost entirely to time, leaving modern readers with texts but no clear sense of who, specifically, had composed them. Enheduanna, a Sumerian high priestess living around 2300 BCE, composed hymns and poetry that survive on cuneiform tablets, several of which explicitly name her as their author, describing her own experiences, including her exile from a temple and eventual restoration to power. Modern Assyriologists, translating these tablets over the 20th century, recognized her as the earliest author in human history whose name we know, predating Homer by well over 1,000 years. This reshapes the early history of literature considerably. Personal, signed authorship existed far earlier than assumed, and remarkably, the first name we have belongs to a woman, a high priestess wielding significant religious and political power in ancient Mesopotamia, writing about her own inner experience with striking emotional candor for a text this old. It means the impulse to say, deliberately, "This is mine, I made this, and here is what happened to me," is far older than the literary traditions usually credited with inventing the personal voice. Long before lyric poetry was supposed to exist, a woman in Mesopotamia had already perfected it. The first name in literature belongs to a woman who insisted on being remembered, and 4,000 years later, she still is. From a single voice to the institutions that taught people how to write at all. The popular image of ancient education, where it existed in the imagination at all, often skipped directly to Greek philosophy, treating structured schooling as essentially a Greek and later Roman invention, with earlier civilizations assumed to rely mostly on informal apprenticeship. The gap existed because evidence of formal schooling requires very specific kinds of artifacts, practice tablets, corrected exercises, lists of vocabulary, the unglamorous debris of a child learning to write, easily overlooked or discarded by excavators, focused on more dramatic finds. Excavations at sites across ancient Mesopotamia, particularly from the early 2nd millennium BCE, have uncovered what scholars call Edubba tablets, literally meaning house of tablets, essentially schoolhouses where young scribes practiced cuneiform. Surviving tablets show repeated copying exercises, corrections made by teachers, and even student complaints about harsh treatment, recorded in texts sometimes referred to by modern translators as school days, describing a student being struck for poor handwriting or tardiness. This reveals an entire formal educational system, complete with curricula, discipline, and clear teacher-student hierarchies, operating more than 1,000 years before classical Greece. Students learned mathematics, law, literature, and religious texts, often training for careers as professional scribes serving temples, palaces, or merchants, in an institution recognizable in its basic shape as a school in any era. It means structured education, with all its frustrations intact, complaints about strict teachers, tedious repetition, the dull ache of memorization, is not a refinement of later civilization. It is one of civilization's oldest companions, present nearly as soon as writing itself existed to be taught. Long before Athens, a child in Mesopotamia was already complaining about homework. From a single classroom to an entire vanished library, buried beneath the rubble of a burning city. For much of modern history, the idea of a great ancient library was associated almost exclusively with Alexandria, the legendary Egyptian institution whose destruction has become a kind of shorthand for the loss of classical knowledge. Earlier civilizations, in the popular imagination, were not assumed to have built anything comparable. The gap existed because the library in question was not made of scrolls, which burn easily and leave little trace, but of clay tablets buried for over 2,000 years beneath the ruins of Nineveh in what is now northern Iraq, unknown to the modern world until systematic excavation began in the region during the 19th century. Beginning in 1849, archaeologist Austin Henry Layard, and later his assistant Hormuzd Rassam, uncovered the remains of a vast royal collection assembled by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE. Tens of thousands of clay tablets and fragments were recovered, covering subjects from medicine and astronomy to law, mythology, and royal correspondence, deliberately gathered, copied, and organized by scribes working under the king's direct patronage, intended as a comprehensive record of available knowledge. When the city of Nineveh was eventually destroyed in 612 BCE, the fire that consumed the wooden parts of the palace actually helped preserve the clay tablets, baking them hard rather than destroying them, an accidental act of preservation born directly out of catastrophe. This discovery proved that the deliberate, systematic accumulation of knowledge for its own sake, not merely administrative record-keeping, but an actual library in spirit, existed centuries before Alexandria, built by a king who seems to have genuinely valued the idea of complete and organized knowledge as a form of power in itself. It suggests humanity's drive to gather, copy, and protect what it knows did not begin with the famous libraries history chose to remember. It was already old by the time those famous libraries were even built. A burning palace, meant to destroy a king's legacy, accidentally preserved his entire library in fired clay.